Good afternoon, good evening, depending upon where you are. This is Professor Aminah Al Deen on Critical Talk on Monday nights, and we are trying to talk a little bit about a country and a people that was in the news but left the news. This is a production of Sound Vision. We're on also on YouTube Live. Please ask your questions. And I thought that today, given what is happening in Gaza at the moment, it has taken over the news. So I reached out along with my producers to find some folk who knew. Um, and to my oh gosh, turning off a phone is an ordeal. And to my pleasure and honor, I have with us this evening Rajagopal. Hopefully, I did that right. Who works with civil rights organizations both here and in India. Could you raise your name? Raise your hand since she put both of you on at the same time so the audience, thank you, can distinguish. And he co founded for Human Rights, and that is a U.S. based advocacy group. Dr. Rohit, am I close?
Yeah, perfect.
Um, Good grief. Is a professor of communication at Santa Clara University. And his most recent work, which I did order, is entitled The Gita for a Global World Ethical Action in the Age of Flux. A very intriguing title. I encourage all of the listeners to get it, and I'm going to ask my producer to put it on the scroll so that in case you miss my announcement of the book, it's an interesting take. And for those of you who know the word Bhagavad Gita because you've watched Jeopardy or some other inane show, this book will give you a little bit more of an insight. So, to get on with a very chock filled agenda, let me ask you, and this is a conversation, except one party, me, is doing little conversing. What is Hinduism? Hinduism has like 1 point something or the other billion adherents in its diaspora and at home. What is it?
Raju, I'll let you take that and then I'll respond.
Yeah, I think I should even start with unlike perhaps, but Hinduism is often described as a way of life, but it also has a very strong spiritual foundation in this so-called Vedas, which are supposed to have been written, I don't know, 2,000 years ago, and I can't be dated, but it's in that sense, it's called the Vedic religion by many people. But
What
right
does that
there,
mean? What does that mean?
that is the people who follow the books called Vedas, Veda, Vedas. So many Hindus consider that to be their quote unquote holy book as well as the Bhagavad Gita. But given the diversity, many Hindus also do not necessarily call themselves followers of Veda. Uh, in fact, there are many strains of Hinduism, often sometimes contradicting one another. Uh, for example, many people outside India polytheistic religion, right? Multiple gods, but at the same time, certain strains of uh, scriptures called the Upanishads talk about a single God. So here's a religion which can tolerate multiple deities as well as talk about higher philosophy of a single God. Uh, so, in many ways, you create your own Hinduism based on the broad strokes that have been offered to us by our ancestors. Uh, and this is where today what we are seeing is certain groups of people who have taken the worst of the past and trying to create a situation where they are the sole definers of Hinduism. And many, many people disagree with that, including myself. Uh, and we'll get into what that is. But I would be remiss if I didn't say everything that I've said so far generally applies to one particular group of people who call themselves Hindus, who under the caste system are so-called upper caste. In other words, the Vedas, the knowledge of the scriptures, education on the scriptures were more or less confined to the small group of scholars who were called Brahmins, which meant a vast majority of Hindus had no real connection with the scriptures other than what the Brahmins, the upper caste, told them that it stood for. And that is beginning to come to the fore today in terms of various contradictions in Hinduism, because as the so-called lower castes are finding their way and discovering themselves and asserting themselves, which has also created a lot of tension. So I'll stop there and have Rohit add or delete, correct if anything I said is not right.
All right. No, thank you very much, Raju. I'll just complement this by saying that, there's a concept in the social sciences about religions being composed of what are called great traditions as well as little traditions, and the great traditions are the traditions of scripture, in a sense, what you might call high Hinduism. But you also have lots of little traditions, which are local forms of Hinduism, folk traditions. So under its umbrella, Hinduism would cover both of those. And, while Hinduism is in some ways, it may appear a more and is a more amorphous religion, you might say, than, the great monotheistic religions, whether it's Judaism, Islam, Christianity, Zoroastrianism, it is also sort of fairly structured and has also become increasingly structured, I would say, over the last 200 years. The reason I make this point is, sometimes an argument is put forth, and it's put forth by people, across the political spectrum, that there is no such thing, or there has been no such thing as Hinduism, that Hinduism is largely a political invention, that it was invented during colonial times by the British. These are arguments people have made forth. There you can see how that argument might apply to some aspects of Hinduism, but it has had its coherence in the same way that the other great religious traditions have. And within Hinduism, there's been a tradition of sort of healthy and robust debate. In fact, one of the things that the Hindu nationalists, and as a kind of shorthand, I would call the Hindu nationalists the Hindu far right or the Hindu right wing. I think that's a good way of kind of understanding them, because Hindu nationalist is an accurate description, but sometimes it kind of almost lets them off the hook by not highlighting the fact that this is a very narrow right wing movement with very specific political aims, which seeks to monopolize the definition. And while that is, it does not exhaust Hinduism, it is, for better or worse, part of the landscape of Hinduism. That's again something I think that needs to be sort of said, because Hindu nationalists and people on the Hindu right, they see themselves as Hindus, they act as Hindus, they believe they are Hindus. So it is part of the landscape of Hinduism, Hindutva or Hindu nationalism or the Hindu right, but it doesn't by any means exhaust Hinduism. And as Raju said, the Hindu right attempts to speak for all of Hinduism. One of the ironies, and I'll stop with this, of course, is that the vision of Hinduism that the Hindu right and the Hindu nationalists seek to promote is ironically very much a colonial European ethno-nationalist derived version. So the irony is that they are claiming that this is the most authentic form of Hinduism, but it borrows and is inspired lock, stock, and barrel by 19th century European ethno-nationalist movements and for some of the pioneering ideologues of Hindu rationalism and the Hindu right, Hitler and the Nazis were great inspiring figures. This is again something that is not is it's known, but it needs to be known more widely.
Okay, well, let's come back to that, because when um, the British were, let's say, encouraged to get out of India by a number of different strategies, and Gandhi was one of them. When India gets around to, and it was a short time, because this is like, what is 1948, 49, somewhere in there.
Yeah.
Um, in their constitution, one of the things that they are, some like the Brahmins, and I'm gonna go back to that. So for our audience, you can distinguish these groups for us. Um, they do in the Constitution. India is a secular, democratic state. What we're talking about is a faith tradition, and even though both of you have alluded to, it is almost ethnic. Um, Explain what's going on here. How did we go from secular pluralism? How many religions are there in India, by the way?
Well, you have, I would say, all the major traditions. So Hindus account for perhaps, 1 billion, 1.05 billion of a 1.4 billion population. I would say there are, about 180 million Muslims. Christians, that's about maybe 10, 12% of the population. Christians are, I think, 4% of the population. Then, there are other smaller communities. There's a Sikh community. There's the Jain community. There are Zoroastrians, and then there are India's indigenous religions as well, which their relationship to Hinduism is an interesting and complicated question. They can be in one sense, be seen under the Hindu fold broadly, but they would not identify necessarily as Hindus, and the Hindu right-wing movement has sought to, kind of co-opt them as Hindus as well. So it has, all the world's major faith traditions. There were also, and there are now, sort of very, very minuscule immigrant Armenian and Jewish communities in India as well. And
Mm.
so it has been, the cliche about India being a sort of melting pot and being diverse in every respect is very much does apply to religion as well. And I'll let Raju take the question about secularism first, and then share some thoughts on it.
Yeah, when I think when there were conversations about what kind of independence uh, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh were all together at that time under the colonial rule, uh, when there were proposals to partition that area based on religion, uh, clearly Pakistan, what is currently the state of Pakistan and the state of Bangladesh, were heavily majority Muslim, so they were naturally candidates for separating from the rest of the subcontinent. However, the India that was left, the main part of India, still had considerable number of Muslims who chose to stay mainly on the promise that the new independent state of India would respect all religions. Had at that time India, like in Pakistan and Bangladesh, declared that India will be only for the Hindus, I think we would have seen a disaster much worse than what actually happened when the partition took place. So wise as our politicians were, they said, given the diversity of who we have in India, we must and the need to respect all religions and focus on a modern state to build the country, we must declare ourselves as a secular state. And secular in Indian constitution is different from secular as a definition of absence of religion. Secularism in India's constitution is like equidistant the state will be equidistant from religions and will not prefer one over the other. Now, there are arguments made now that that has been one of the problems of the secular constitution, which inevitably within the constitutional uh, conversations, it has actually turned into Hindu nation without violating the constitution per se. So there are
Yeah.
arguments whether that idea was good or not, whether the state should have completely divorced itself from religion and let the religious leaders take
Mm.
over. That debate is still continuing. But that was the basis of declaring secularism as the basis of our constitution. But also, uh, there were compromises made in that process, which is to respect the personal religious laws of different religions, particularly Islam. So the assurances are made that the Sharia law, to the extent that it was practiced in among the Muslim community, will be respected as far as personal laws goes, uh, and the civil courts will not intervene with personal law. Uh, Now, that is being portrayed today as a special treatment for Muslims. It clearly wasn't. It was part and parcel of the agreement based on which many Muslims stayed back in India. And to now, after 75 years, to say, oops, we made a mistake, we shouldn't have accepted your Sharia law as a personal law, is creating a lot of headache with the Hindu right today. So that's the base. They, in fact, want to drop the word secular from the constitution. I'm talking about the Hindu right that's in power now.
Really?
Yes. And in fact, there are even proposals by some of the extremist elements within the party that's ruling to completely abandon the constitution and declare some scriptural part of Hinduism, which is called Manusmriti, which actually dictates the imposition of the caste rule as a model for the Indian constitution. Now, that's a minority, of course, because
Wait a minute. Hold tight.
yeah,
I'm following you to each, but I need some clarification.
sure.
What is the casserole and why is it in the 21st century still there? And
Why?
does it apply across faiths?
Yeah, yes. So it's a good question. It's a good question. I think let me give you a little bit of a background on that in the context of the Constitution. The creator or the architect of the Indian Constitution, uh, Dr. Ambedkar, himself was considered to be from quote unquote the untouchable class, who didn't belong to any caste at all. They were even lower. And his whole premise uh, and his dream was India would annihilate the caste system. Unfortunately, 75 years later, we still have caste system operative in probably uh, less stringent in some ways, but you cannot take the privileges
Mm.
that so-called upper castes have been brought up with for centuries and erase those privileges overnight. So there is a lot of reaction from the privileged people not to annihilate the caste, because which means their future generation will not benefit in the same way as past did. So
Now,
caste,
this is across faiths, whether you're a Jain or a Muslim or whatever, you are still in a caste.
less so in other traditions like Islam, but there have been caste operates in a different way in Islam, uh, depending on whether people owe their origin to the Middle East or local converts who are often in the south, who are often darker skinned. And there is a certain level of caste system operating there, and I'm not an expert on it. It's not in the
Mm.
same way as in Hinduism, where the stratification has been much more rigid in the past.
How
So
many
you raise a good
are
question.
there?
Sorry,
How many castes are there?
I mean, there are four main castes according to
Okay.
the ancient traditions, but within those castes, there are hundreds, literally hundreds and thousands of subcastes. based on different traditions, based
Too
on,
much. Too much.
yeah.
I'll just sort of chime in here about the fact that broadly caste it's not exclusive by one definition to Hinduism. So in the American imagination and the Western imagination, it's often associated exclusively with Hinduism or with India. It's basically a system of hierarchy based on descent. So you also have communities, for instance, in Japan or in Somalia, who are considered in some ways to be at the bottom of some kind of caste pyramid.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And I say this because there was an initiative in California recently, which was passed by the Senate and the House, but was unfortunately and regrettably vetoed by the governor Gavin Newsom, which is a whole other story about the politics of the caste privileged Hindu community here, leveraging their influence.
Yes.
And it was bipartisan. It had been passed to include caste explicitly as another category of protection under Title IX, and the definition there was introduced by Senator Aisha Wahab, did point out that this is a hierarchical system of descent which applies to different parts of the world. And in India, it is found across different faiths. So it's associated most strongly with Hinduism, but you do find Indian Christians, Indian Sikhs, Indian Muslims, will often make a distinction between those who will claim, either origins, Ashraf origins from the Prophet, or will claim some kind of, upper class ancestry also, because class and caste privilege also work together. Indian Christians
So
as
are
well.
we talking ethnicity? Can anybody transition to Hinduism? Who's
It's
Indian? Who's
it's
not from India?
It's well, here's the very interesting question, right? So this is the question about social mobility. So one, there is a thesis. There is a thesis in Indian sociology called Kshatriyaization, and I won't get into too many details, but the Kshatriya caste in the fourfold caste system was beneath the Brahmins. The Brahmins were the caste, the learning caste that monopolized learning. They were the sort of priests and scholars. The Kshatriyas were the warrior caste. Then there was a merchant caste. Then there was a caste of people who did manual labor. And then at the bottom were people who were beneath the caste system itself,
Mm-hmm.
supposed to be untouchable. Now, there's one thesis which says, and again, these are perspectives contested in scholarship, that as people form marginal castes, subaltern castes, got political power, they sort of reinvented their caste identities. They claimed to be of warrior descent, right? So they claimed, so once you have political power, you can rewrite your origin story, right? So,
Tell me about it.
so that's the argument. But despite that, and despite whatever element of truth there is to it, it has been a fairly rigid system. In fact, there is one line of thinking which the Hindu right resorts to, which blames the British for introducing and imposing the caste system, and it claims that Hinduism was much more mobile and flexible before that. That is not true.
I didn't.
Caste is a total social fact in Hindu and other communities in India. Now, what makes this very interesting, though, is that if you are a Westerner, right, and perhaps if you are a white Westerner, if you're a privileged Westerner, you are very easily adopted into the Hindu fold. You may not have a caste, but that is kind of what a lot of godmen, whether it's the Maharishi Mahesh Yogi or Rajneesh, that's
Okay.
it's an Orientalist stereotypical version of Hinduism as well, right? Which is yoga and godmen and Ravi Shankar and sitar sounds playing in the background.
Uh-huh.
Now, do you have a caste? If you are someone who has been welcomed in, or you were born John Smith, but you've become Swami some Ramananda or something like that. Even if you don't have a caste, you still are coded as privileged. Whereas within, someone who is from a subaltern or a marginal caste background, there would be severe social consequences to them trying to pass as being from.
Oh, okay.
So, this, and in some ways, this is also part of our, a certain kind of colonial legacy, a certain kind of colonial mindset, a certain kind of colorism that goes with caste. So those are, a few thoughts I would have on caste specifically.
That's fascinating. I'm going to take a short break of a few minutes as you go grab some water, and we launch into uh, Hindutva.
Sure.
Did I get it right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Just make one quick point.
Sure.
The answer to kind of a statistic that I read recently, which surprised me, is that 4% of Hindu Americans are white.
Well, that's fascinating. Yeah.
It is. Did they tell the Hindus?
These are people in the US, born white Americans who have converted or see themselves as Hindus. And they come from
How
all
can
the
you, convert to something that is that amorphous with no ancestors? Never mind. We'll save that for another conversation.
exactly.
Let us take a break, a couple of minutes, um, and we'll come back and hit Hindu nationalism. This is Professor Aminah Al Deen for Critical Talk, a program from Sound Vision TV. Please watch Muslim Network News. It is so exciting. We'll be right back. Good afternoon. This is Professor Aminah Al Deen for Critical Talk, a production of Sound Vision. Please watch all of our programs and especially watch Muslim Network News, whose news I watch every day to find out what's happening in the world. I have the honor this early evening, I'm in between evening and night here, of speaking with Rajagopal, who works with civil rights, human rights in India. He is a co founder of the Hindus for Human Rights, which is a US based advocacy group, and Dr. Rohit Chopra, who's a professor of communication at Santa Clara, whose most recent work, and I really want you all to take a look at this text, is the Gita for a Global World. ethical action in the age of flux. I think that that is an extremely insightful talent, and these men are giving me, whoa, wait, a lesson. My pad is full here, and I've only touched the surface, and I'll call it Indian stuff because I don't even know what we're doing anymore. But one of the things that was told to me earlier was that the second largest Hindu temple is in America. Is that true?
Uh, if they're referring to the one in New Jersey, it's probably true. If you
Oh, wait.
sheer size, yes.
Are the Hindus taking over?
That, that
Yeah,
would be that would be the Hindu nationalist fantasy because
there you go. But, it seems like this every sense in the world, the idea of nation states was created and boundaries were put between peoples and all this other crap comes along that we've instigated just I don't want to call it because all of it isn't violent in the sense of I go get a gun and I shoot you, but it's violent in terms of the psyche, in terms of communication, in terms of how we turn lies into the qualifying truth. I feel sorry for Rohit, who's trying to teach communication because how do you communicate when any darn thing you say can that is truthful? I see it in front of me. There's a fact about it, or several, is now a lie. Uh, it seems as though everybody wants to live in this wonderful nation state where there's only them in control. But they don't even like each other. So I don't know how all of that's going to work out either. I mean, they will find a way to not like each other whenever and whomever, and I'm sure it was called something else, introduced the notion of caste by color, caste by education, caste by where you live, however darn many castes there are. Somebody ought to dig that person up and shoot him again because it has caused so much trouble. I was reading before October 6th, I was trying to figure out how to go for, I'll call it the mess that is India. And is that mess spreading? I live in Maryland, up the street from Washington. And oh my goodness, my news alerts were blasting because Modi was coming to America. And I'm saying, okay, what does that mean? I mean, it seems to me that Modi's been hanging out with America undercover or at cover for a long time. So, what does that mean? All these people are going. So, what is this Hindutva? You've told me a little bit about it, and it has great support here, and people can pour lots of money from here into it. So, take your best shot.
Rohit, you want to go first?
okay, sure. So Hindutva or Hindu nationalism is, in a nutshell, it is the idea that India, in its cultural ethos, is fundamentally a Hindu country, that the essence of Indian identity is Hindu, and that minorities, especially Muslims and Christians, can never really be truly Indian. So when the constitution says that India is secular, I just want to go back a bit and complement again what Raju pointed out, that one other reason that the architects of the constitution and that generation of Indian leaders, Nehru, Gandhi, and others, right, advocated for this distinctive form of Indian secularism is not because they felt they needed a solution top down, to manage, the problems in the wake of the partition of the subcontinent. That was part of it. But that secularism was also something that they felt was part of a genuine reflection of what the reality of Indian history had been. Now, of course, wherever there are different groups over centuries, there will be some conflict, right? But so there was some conflict, but in a sense, identities were genuinely syncretic and shared. You actually have Indian communities that where people identified as both Hindus and Muslims.
Hmm.
You still have, there's a thinker, wonderful Indian thinker, Ashish Nandi, who shared something with a professor of mine, Professor Abdullah Yannaim, and he said that, you talk to someone and you ask them that, are you a Christian? And they'll say no. But then they will say, which God do you worship? And they'll say, Jesus Christ, right?
I'm
But
sorry.
these identities, the idea that you can only be of one religion, in some ways, is a sort of particularly Western idea also. And these identities that you can only be of one religion, they in part become kind of set in stone in during British colonial rule, right? The idea that these are separate people. But the reality is that we've always had these shared traditions. I mean, you look at people who are part of the Hindu rite today, and the dress they wear is a dress that is Muslim in origin, right?
Mhm.
So, there you have it. And that's just sort of one sort of trivial example that I'm giving. So, anyways, what happens is this movement starts actually in the 19th century, and it picks up steam. The word Hindutva is first used in the 19th century. It starts as a kind of response to, on the one hand, the idea that India was this glorious Hindu civilization and it had fallen into disarray. Hindus had been subjugated by Muslim invaders, right? And now Hinduism needed to sort of revive again.
Mm.
Hindus needed to reclaim what was rightfully theirs.
And
Culturally,
that would have been the Mughals, right?
it would have been the Mughals, but before the Mughals, there was the Delhi Sultanate. The first invasion was in 712. But so this is a very sort of simplistic understanding of Indian identity, because when you had the conquest of a part of India, Sindh, which is now in Pakistan, in 712 AD by Muhammad bin Qasim, uh, after he conquers Sindh, his entire administration is made up of caste privileged Hindus, right? And you could have a Muslim ruler who had an army that was largely Hindu and a Hindu ruler whose army that was largely Muslim.
Mm.
So you can't divide Indian identity into this. There was an pristine, untouched Hinduism at one point of time, and it was contaminated by these Muslim outsiders, and now we need to reclaim it. But that was the thinking, and that's the impetus behind the movement.
Well, didn't Gandhi kind of fight for a Hindu nationalism and his strategies against the British?
So it's an interesting question about Gandhi's nationalism, and I will say no, he didn't. He wasn't a Hindu nationalist, though some have critiqued Gandhi's uh, ideology as giving too much emphasis to religion, and through giving too much emphasis to religion, giving Hinduism a bit of a free pass. But
Okay.
the other reading is that Gandhi, like Nehru in his own way, understood that Western style separation of religion and state is not going to work, simply because that has not been the history of India. Indian religious identities have been shared. The separation of public sphere and private sphere in the West doesn't work in India. Religion is not something relegated to the private sphere.
Hmm.
Now, Gandhi's Hinduism was also, it was radical, it was heterodox, it was playful. And just today, I read a wonderful article by Ramachandra Guha, who's a very esteemed and well-known Indian historian, and he's Gandhi's biographer. And I would say he's one of the greatest living authorities on Gandhi. And he points out something very interesting. He said, Gandhi, who was a devout Hindu, and the Gita was Gandhi's favorite work, in a sense, the most profound work, because he saw in it a kind of parable of good and evil. Gandhi very rarely went to Hindu temples. I didn't know this. I learned this today from Ram Guha's article, because for him, temples were also sites where people from so-called untouchable background, Dalits, were excluded. So Gandhi actually went to very few. So there is a line of critique of Gandhi, and Gandhi should be critiqued, because in the spirit of critical thinking. No one should be exempt from critique. No religious tradition should be exempt from critique. But I don't think Gandhi is a Hindu nationalist. So what happens is,
If you look, I'm going to just move you forward a little bit. Modi, if I'm not mistaken, was the, oh goodness, chief minister in Gujarat.
yes,
And a bunch of Muslims got murdered. I'm sure some others too. Why?
Raju, do you want to take that?
Yeah, yeah. I happened to be there shortly after that.
Oh, I'm so thankful that you're still with us.
Uh, yeah, I think the idea was the ideology of the Modi's party had always been there to assert themselves, and their foundation of their organization, which is actually called the RSS, which is the parent organization that was formed in 1925, was always based on doing everything they can to disenfranchise Muslims. The hatred for Muslims and Christians was very fundamental. And the cadres who had been attending their training sessions for almost 90 years, this is a very basic tenet of their party from which Modi comes. So when he was chief minister, uh, it gave him an opportunity to exploit a tragedy where a train carrying Hindu pilgrims was set on fire or caught fire, and 59 pilgrims, supposedly all devout Hindu pilgrims going to a holy city, which may or may not be true, was set of afire, and 59 people died. Now, rather than do the thing that you would expect a constitutionally elected leader, is to condemn the act, arrest the perpetrators, and and implore people to observe peace and calm, Modi went the other way. He used the opportunity to display those charred bodies in the main city of Ahmedabad to basically incite people, and 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 he gave people 48 hours of free hand to do whatever they want against the Muslims, and that is be order directly from him, although he says no. All the cell phone records and everything have been wiped out, so nobody knows. So it was a opportunity that his so-called RSS was waiting for, and here was a golden opportunity to incite Hindus to say, "Look what the Muslims did to Hindus," and that resulted overnight in hundreds of people, total of 1,000 to 2,000 people, most of the Muslims dead, and in the police shooting, some Hindus also got killed. But
Mhm.
it was labeled as a successful experiment. Even today, his government says what they did in Gujarat was a great thing. They put Muslims in their place, and it was a successful experiment, which is now going to be extended to all of India. When they said that in 2002, nobody believed that India would allow them to go that far, but unfortunately, that's kind of where we are right now. So that's the story of why so many people were killed, and Modi was never held responsible for anything, even though without his silent consent, these things would not have happened.
Mhm. So
And
where, um, I mean, you all have given such great lectures here. I got a zillion questions. Where's India now?
Right,
So it's always sort of complicated, and I'm sitting additionally complicated by the fact that I'm sitting thousands of miles away, and even if you're in India, it's hard to predict. So right now, there's a professor of constitutional law, I think the London School of Economics, Tarunab Khaitan, and I was watching an interview with him recently, and he says the constitution notwithstanding, he said in many ways India has already become a Hindu state or a Hindu Rashtra. It is
Okay.
um, and one reason why perhaps the Hindu right will not need to amend the constitution is that the project of Hindutva has been realized in many ways. So that said, while it seems that the Hindu right is ascendant, and Modi came to power on the back of a very convincing victory in 2014. a general election victory that was repeated in 2019. Uh, and he has consolidated power in some states. There are parts of India where, at the level of the state government, in the southern part of India, there is not a single state which is now governed by the Hindu right or the BJP. So,
Is this a big group like the MAGA head wearing people for Trump here?
in the US,
Mm-hmm.
yes. So the US, so yeah, and I'll just basically say that the election, there's an election coming up in 2024. Modi's expected to win. In the long run, though, and a lot of people who I think are more knowledgeable than I feel that India is, in the ultimate analysis, too diverse for this kind of narrow ideology to hold, and eventually it will break. The question, the Hindu right stranglehold. The question is, what damage will the poison do, and what will de-sangification or whatever the equivalent of denazification, what will it take? Yes, the diaspora, particularly in the Bay Area where I live, has at least for 30 years been a very, very strong base of support for for the Hindu right, and I think Raju can also speak to this. There are other areas like New Jersey, and one of the things that I find very disconcerting about the Hindu American community of mostly of Indian origin is in America, Hindu Americans of Indian American origin uh, vote overwhelmingly for Democrats. And you claim to stand for equal rights. You want minority rights. You want full freedom of expression for yourself and your children to practice Hinduism, right? You want your children to be able to get the holidays on Diwali. You want to be able to go to your temples. You want that freedom of religion, freedom of expression, equal rights, citizenship. You want to deny, but the same people want to deny it to Muslims and Christians in particular in India. And that's, in a sense, that is just absolutely shameful. And I have to say that politicians like Rohit Khanna have also been a massive, massive disappointment in claiming to be, they are Democrats here, but pandering to Modi
Wait a
for
minute, who was that you said?
Rohit Khanna. He's a senator from California, right?
Congress.
Mhm.
Congressman, sorry, and you know why he represents the district he represents, Pleasanton. I think it's in the East Bay. It is very Indian heavy. A lot of the Indians there or Hindus there of Hindus, U.S. citizens are work in the tech industry too. It's again a bastion of the Hindu right, and there is actually a Hindu right wing organization called the Hindu Swayam Sevak Sangh, the HSS, which is you can consider it the American wing of the mothership, the RSS. They have like a few thousand, 3,000 branches, I think, something of that sort in the US. So, again, here is someone who claims to stand for democratic values, talks a good game about, unions, about equal rights, about labor rights, about abortion rights. But when it comes, he's also someone who invited Modi, right? And is so this is a phenomenon called the Modi Democrats, which is
Oh, they invited Mo.
Yes. If I
Oh, get out of here.
can I add my perspective a little bit, first on the history. We talked about the secular constitution. We talked about the Hindu right wing taking its birth in the late 19th century and in 1925. But what happened when when India got independence is the first Prime Minister Nehru put this entire organization, banned banned this organization because he knew they would stand in the way of India's progress. For several decades, Modi's party was illegal. Not when I say party, the home base called the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh, and it is only later on, after the Gujarat pogroms, this party became more prominent because of their dominance of the social media, the clever ways of spreading false information. And today they pretty much own the social media in India. So even people who believed in India's secularism, like some of my relatives and friends, have begun to talk the Modi language. It shows the power of the media, the social media. And they're doing it in concert with and in collusion with our social media giants who are acting favorably towards the Modi government, whether it is Twitter, whether it is Facebook,
Mhm.
Google, every one of them are looking to their profit at the expense of being part of destroying India's democracy. And that's what we need to fight for. So, just a little note about who we
How does one strategize a fight? I mean, I can get with Gandhi and what was it, spinning wheels and the tax on salt. How does one in the 21st century begin to strategize a bulwark against what can only be bad for a lot of people?
that is what we are attempting to do is based on the premise that large majority of Hindus are by and large tolerant people. They have they relate to pluralism, and they have been kind of overtaken by the propaganda of the current regime for the last 10 years, which means we have to speak up.
Mm. Well, how are you going to do that if they're dominating?
So, in a small way, what we're trying to do is we speak as progressive Hindus who want to not reinvent, but uh, talk to Hindus who have been taken over by this propaganda uh, through various means, whether it's webinar to countering disinformation, uh, and basically make the case that it is not just India that's going to suffer, that Hinduism as we have known it is actually going to be irreparably harmed in the way these people are claiming to represent Hinduism. So there is some level of positive reaction in India, but to us, the main audience is the Indian American audience, especially the younger generations who grew up admiring the Indian American Constitution, admiring their cultural heritage in India, and also want to work towards environmental justice, gender justice, indigenous rights, and so forth. So we are attracting basically large numbers of younger generations of Indian Americans, and I
Okay,
think that's where the hope lies for them to make a difference as future lawmakers in this country to be able to counter what is happening, because this is a long-term process. It's not going to be
that's
uh,
true.
corrected overnight.
Well, let me ask both of you to turn your attention to the question that's on the screen. Are the Muslims, Sikhs, Christians, and other Indian minorities in India coming together to support one another against Hindutva?
It's a very good question. Each group has its own, I think, relationship to Hindutva, but they also, and the Modi government. Uh, there was a protest, a farmers' protest in India, which was one of the few instances of the Modi government actually backing down on some reforms they wanted to introduce in the farming sector. And a lot of the farmers are, happen to be Sikhs, because Punjab, where it's the birthplace of Sikhism, is a major sort of agricultural center, and they got a lot of support from the diasporic Sikh community here. But that also comes with sort of complicated history, because there was a secessionist militant movement for a separate Sikh homeland, which was very violent and was also crushed very violently in the 80s. And that movement has sort of revived now, with attacks on the Indian consulate in London and in San Francisco. And that, again, is something that is being used to shore up Hindu votes. I don't know about what kind of organized links there are between different communities, uh, but maybe Raju can speak to that.
Yeah.
Let me ask my producer to put back the question that was just on the screen. We only have a few minutes left, but I want to no, the other one.
Yeah, Philip, may I answer Philip's
Do you
yes,
know Philip?
Philip Holland?
No, I'm just messing with you. Just ignore me.
Yeah.
You
Uh,
said that so quickly. I thought maybe he's a student of yours too. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think he's absolutely right in saying peaceful and tolerant Hindus whose representation is also being destroyed by the Hindutva ideologies. And many of them are unable to speak up now because they're afraid of what the Modi government may do to them,
Exactly.
with massive curbs on press freedoms. So the idea of different faiths working together, a lot of it has to happen underground, so to speak, because the moment anything is seen as a threat to the government, they come up with some sort of a false case against the leaders, and they rot in jail for months and months without even facing a court of law. And we have several prisoners of conscience today who have been there for 3 to 4 years without any charges being filed. So that's where we come in the diaspora. We have to bring together all the communities from India. We have to stand together against Hindutva, Muslims, Hindus, Christians.
Excuse me. Well, let me say this. I intend to do a series on elections. Excuse me again. Something got in my nose. Man, I want to talk about how across the globe it seems as something called the right, it probably used to be called conservatism. I'm not too sure. As soon as people start labeling stuff, I get very uneasy. But I want to bring you to and your thoughts about Hindus' version of it, along with some other versions of it, because I think we're all going down the same rabbit hole in many of the same ways. Perhaps we haven't connected all the dots, but what you all have taught me tonight is that there's lots of connection. And I would really appreciate if I could get a yes from both of you now so I don't have to hunt you down in the future to get it because this is exciting. But I don't think that people see that there's some global patterns.
You're absolutely right. There is a kind of global right-wing backlash, and we see similar things to do with it's a because social media is global, the undermining of institutions through social media, demonization of minorities, greater rigidity with borders, conspiracy theories about Soros and globalization, global elites and cabals. And these right-wing movements, they actually borrow elements from each other. So I'd be very honored and privileged to be part of any conversation.
Not as honored and privileged as I would be to have both of you back. It's been a blast. Um, and doggone it, I haven't taken that many notes since I was in graduate school. But Dr. Chopra, Mr. Rajagopal, please come back. Share this because I'm telling you, Americans don't know. They'll buy, well, you know that already, anything that's put in front of them in a nice kind of way. So we want to challenge people to think and the issues between Hindus and Muslims over there, and Christians and Sikhs and Jains, because they don't have a clue as to what that is. And you are aware of once you land here, everybody's Hindu. Check this out. You're not only Hindu, but you're Muslim. So you might wind up on a no fly list. Let me once again give my thanks to both of you for such an intellectually stimulating evening. This is Professor Aminah Al Deen, and I'll be back with these two gentlemen plus in the very near future because 2024 is already upon us. This is Critical Talk, which is a production of Sound Vision. Uh, please watch us. And I'm going to ask my two guests to stay on after for a moment. But thank you very much.